Hello, I'm Kevin Frender with Black Dog LED, and today I'd like to go over starting plants for your outdoor garden indoors early to get a jump start on your summer garden. Now, the very first step in this is planning for starting your seedlings inside, and that's what we're going to go over in this particular video. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, it's not spring yet. In fact, we're in the dead of winter, but now is the time when you need to plan for starting your garden inside. So I'm going to go over some of the things you will need to plan for, things you will need to get. First of all, you're going to need to get your seeds, whatever you want to plant for the year. And that's always a fun thing, looking through seed catalogs, trying to figure out what you're going to grow. One of the best pieces of advice after having been doing this for over 40 years now is find out what grows best in your area. Talk to other local gardeners in your area because, for example, a tomato variety that does very well here in Colorado may not do as well in a different state. We all have different weather, we have different climates, and so it's important to figure out what grows best in your area. And a lot of that is just trial and error. Every year I start 8 or 9 different kinds of tomatoes, and usually 1 or 2 of those is a variety I've never grown before that I just try out. So after getting your seeds, the next thing you need to plan for is adequate light. The problem is being next to a window, you have to worry about cold drafts coming in through the window. The light is always very directional, coming in only from one direction through the window, so the seedlings have a tendency to grow over and lean at an angle and become floppy, and it just doesn't work very well, especially if you're trying to start a lot of seedlings, which I'm guilty of every year. I usually start several hundred plants every year, and I just don't have enough windowsill space. Besides, my cat competes for it. So, one important thing is the light, and here I've got our cute little 125 watt PhytoMAX-4 light. This is actually sufficient light to start about a 3 by 3 foot area full of plants and get them growing to the size that would be appropriate to put outdoors when the warmer weather comes. Now, another unique thing about our light is because we actually have ultraviolet in our spectrum, it gives the plants the same amount of ultraviolet light that they're going to get when you move them outside into full sunlight when it is warm enough to do so. Now, if you start plants under a fluorescent light or a normal white LED light that doesn't have ultraviolet in it, you will find that you have to do what's called hardening off of the plants, which is to acclimate them slowly to full sunlight, because it's kind of like if you were indoors all winter long and you suddenly take a beach vacation to Aruba, you're going to get a sunburn if you go out in the full sun because you're not used to that ultraviolet exposure. Same thing with plants, but if you use our PhytoMAX lights, because they have ultraviolet in the spectrum to begin with, you can actually move the plants straight from under these lights straight outdoors without having to harden them off for light. Another thing to consider is air movement. You don't want the plants to be grown, especially as little seedlings, in an environment with no air movement whatsoever, because plants only make their stem as strong as it needs to be. So if they're not experiencing windy conditions or air movement in general, like they will definitely get outside, then the plant stems are simply not going to be strong enough, and when you do move them outside, oftentimes the stems will bend or break, sometimes snap completely. So you want to give them some artificial wind with an oscillating fan. It's not good enough just to have a plain unidirectional fan that's not moving back and forth, because, again, the plant will only grow its stem as strong as it needs to be. And if the wind, the artificial wind, is only coming from one direction and always coming from the same direction, the stem will grow strong in that direction. But if you turn the plant 90 degrees, it's going to fall over because it didn't strengthen its stem in all of the directions it needs to. So it's important to use an oscillating fan that is sweeping back and forth so that the wind is coming from random directions on the plants, and that will make for a healthy, happy seedling. Now, to get started, you should also realize that not every plant should be started at the same time. Some types of plants grow much faster than others, and some of them really don't like spending time in a small pot, which is generally what you should be starting your seeds in. If you try and start your seeds in a 1-gallon pot like this, it's actually very difficult because this holds so much moisture or so much soil that the moisture in here is very uneven. If there's not roots throughout this entire pot, then When you water it, the soil at the bottom is going to stay wet, and as you plant seeds in the top, that's going to dry out because it's exposed to the air, but the bottom's still going to be too wet, and you're going to end up with a soil moisture gradient, which is not good for your plants. Up here it's too dry, down here it's too wet for their roots. You want to have the soil be even moistness throughout the entire pot, which is why I always recommend starting seeds in a very tiny pot, something like these 6-packs, or at most, what I typically use is a 2.5-inch pot like this. Now, there is one exception for that, and we'll get into that in a minute. But generally, you want to start seeds in a small pot, and then as the plants grow, you can transplant them into a larger pot, but you don't want to go straight from a very small pot to a large pot, because then you have the same problem of too much soil in here without the roots going into it means that they're going to have too much of a soil moisture gradient, and the very center part, which does have the roots that came out of this pot, is going to get dry, whereas the rest of the soil in the pot mass stays too wet. So it's always best to transplant up in sizes. Typically what I'll do is start a lot of my seedlings in little tiny cells like this. And I'll actually put several seeds per pot, these little tiny pots, because not every seed you plant is going to germinate and grow into a plant. And I hate filling up a bunch of pots worth of soil and then just throwing it out because the seed didn't germinate in it. So what I do is start 2 or 3 seeds in a cell like this. So in this one, I'd have somewhere between 12 and 18 seeds that I'd plant in here. I wait for them to germinate, and then I very carefully tease the seedlings apart, and that will be a subject of a future video we'll be doing. And then I transplant them into a 2-inch pot, where they'll probably live, depending on the type of plant, for between a week and 3 weeks, depending on the type of plant. And then I'll transplant them into a 4.5-inch pot, and then finally into a gallon pot. I generally never go with anything larger than a 1-gallon pot for seedlings that I start indoors for transplantation outdoors, because I don't have enough room, number one. Number two, the plants just start getting so large that it becomes problematic. And number three, it's much more painful to dig a large hole in your garden. The 1-gallon pot is about the perfect size, I find, for the maximum. Now again, different plants have different needs there. So for example, for tomatoes, I will go through the entire process that I just told you about. But for peppers, I generally actually finish off with them in the 4.5-inch pot size, because they're smaller plants in general than tomatoes. A properly grown tomato plant will get absolutely huge. I typically get them more than 8 feet tall every single year. So you can get away with starting seeds for cucumbers, melons, and squash in a larger pot. And I actually recommend starting those in a 4.5-inch pot, but you only want to do it about 2 to 3 weeks before you're actually going to be transplanting them outdoors. Because if they spend too much time in this small pot, they're going to get root bound and they're actually going to get stunted. They will never perform as well. If you start them less than 2 weeks before you want to transplant them outdoors, their roots aren't going to fill this pot. And then when you're trying to transplant them into the garden, taking the soil out of here, the soil is going to fall away from the roots, and then their roots are getting disturbed, which they don't like. So you want to start those particular 3 types of plants, the melons, the cucumbers, and the squash, and get them to fill up their roots, but not in their pot, but not to the point where they're starting to get stunted in the pot. And so that means you've only got a 2 to 3 week window basically between when you plant those seeds and when they should be planted in the ground. Now you could use an even larger pot, like a 1-gallon pot, but then you end up running into some of the same problems with, if the roots aren't completely filling the pot, when you go to transplant it, the soil's going to fall away. They don't like that. So that's why for those particular types of plants, I like to use a 4.5-inch pot. So with the squash, cucumbers, and melons, I mentioned that you want to start those seeds 2 to 3 weeks before you put them in the ground, or before you intend to put them in the ground. But that brings up a bigger point of different kinds of plants should have their seeds started at different periods of time before your average last frost date. So for example, for tomatoes, generally you want to start your tomato seedlings at least 4 weeks before you're ready to put them in the ground. But if you start them more than about 8 weeks before you're ready to transplant them outside, the tomato plants start growing really fast, and they start getting really tall really fast once they get through their teenagehood. And it becomes impractical to transplant them outdoors. It becomes impractical to keep them growing indoors because they need staking and they need support, and it's very difficult to provide that in a little pot. So generally my rule of thumb is that I start my tomato plants 6 to 8 weeks before I'm ready to plant them outdoors. With peppers, they're a much smaller plant in general. They don't grow as quickly as tomato plants do. So you can start those seeds 6 to at most, I would say 12 weeks. And it really does depend on the type of pepper as well. I've actually got 2 plants here that happen to be both 12 weeks old. This is a variety called Cajun Bell. It is a miniature bell pepper with a little bit of heat to it, but as you can see, it's actually got red ripe fruit on it. In fact, this is not the first fruit that have ripened on it. I've been snacking off of this thing for weeks now. So this plant at 12 weeks old is clearly well large enough to plant outside. And in fact, normally I would start bell pepper type seeds and most chili pepper type seeds 6 to 8 weeks before I'm ready to transplant them outside, because you don't need them to be this big, number one. And number two, if I had these pots sitting side by side in my little seedling growing area, this plant is larger than the pot, and so it's going to shade out and crowd out plants that are next to it. So if you want to maximize the number of plants you can start in an indoor growing area, you really don't want them to get that much wider than the pot. So this one clearly is too old for that. On the other hand, for habanero or Scotch bonnet or Carolina Reaper type pepper plants, these tend to grow much slower and they take a much longer time to reach maturity, so I will start those closer to 10 to 12 weeks before I'm ready to transplant them outside, so that I can get an earlier harvest of the ripe fruit in the summer. Even if I do that, I tend not to get any ripe fruit until mid-summer on those types of peppers, just because they are so slow. So this is a 12-week-old habanero pepper plant, and you can actually see it's got little tiny habaneros on it. They're probably about 1/3 the size they're going to get, but nothing's ripe. And in fact, these peppers won't be ripe and ready to eat for another probably 6 weeks, which is why I start the habanero type and Scotch bonnet type pepper seeds 10 to 12 weeks before I'm ready to transplant them outside. Other kinds of seeds, lettuce, things like that, that you might want to start inside, because they're small plants in general, for lettuce specifically, I generally will not start them too early, maybe 1 or 2 weeks before I'm ready to transplant them outside. But a lot of these things, you really don't have to start. They are fast enough growing that generally most people can get away with putting those seeds straight into the ground in your garden. It's only the plants that have a really long growing season, things like peppers and tomatoes, that you do want to start indoors early. And if you're up further north, like we are here in Colorado, plants like watermelon don't have quite a long enough growing season if you just plant the seeds in the ground when the average date of last frost is. And you're lucky if you get any ripe watermelon before the first frost of fall happens. So that's why it is useful sometimes to start those squash, melons, and cucumber plants 2 to 3 weeks before the average last frost date, just to extend that growing season a little bit and get yourselves a better chance of, for example, a ripe watermelon up north. Now there's a couple of tricks I'd like to mention as well. I've gone over the different pot sizes, but some things that will make your life a lot easier. With the small, narrow pots like this, which I love using, they're very easy to tip over, especially while you're watering them. If you start having a taller plant in it, it's really easy for these things to tip over. So at your local garden center, you can find tray inserts like this, which have individual cells to hold the pots. And you can see once that pot's in there, I can turn this tray completely on its side and the pot's not going to fall out. So that's very helpful in terms of holding the plants upright. It also provides an advantage if you're trying to maximize the number of seeds or seedlings that you've got going. You can do things like putting pots in every other cell in the tray, so as the plants are getting larger, you can space them out, and this forces a nice even spacing for the plants. Another thing that's going to make your life a lot easier is if you have a tray with no holes in the bottom that you can put your pots into. And these other trays happen to be designed to fit perfectly into these trays. This makes it a lot easier to water the plants. If you're not watering them in place, you can just pick up a whole flat, which this is called in the nursery trade a flat. You can pick up a whole flat of seedlings all at once, take them to where you're going to water them, and then set them back under your grow light. The other thing you can do is if you happen to overwater the plants, you don't want all of these pots just sitting in water, so you can just take this tray out, take this full of water, take it to the sink, dump it out, and put your flat back in, and that makes life a lot easier. The other trick is when you're first starting seeds, you want to keep the soil nice and evenly moist. You don't want it to dry out, and you don't want to keep it too wet while the seeds are germinating. So one trick for that is to cover your pots after you've planted the seeds so that you keep them from being exposed to the air. Now you don't want to seal them up completely, you just want to have a decent cover on there. So you can use something like a plastic film wrap and just place it over the top of the pots or over the top of an entire tray full of pots, and that will help keep the moisture in. You don't want to use something that is opaque to light though, because a lot of seeds actually need exposure to a little bit of light to germinate. So you want to use something that's clear and allows the light through. As soon as you see the seedling germinating, you want to remove that covering and expose the seedling to the ambient air conditions, because you want it to acclimate to the environment it's going to be growing in, the rest of your normal indoor house air. One thing I do see people doing all the time that is a problem is they think that, well, this little tiny seedling is so tiny, I have to baby it. I have to give it really high humidity and treat it very gently and give it low light levels. Well, if you think about it, when you're planting seeds out in the ground, when they first come out of the ground, they immediately get full sunlight and they immediately are exposed to normal air conditions outside. They don't have high humidity. They don't have low light levels. So you don't want to replicate any of those high humidity and low light levels inside. It will only cause the seedling to grow tall, leggy, and weak. And specifically, high humidity can cause problems with a condition called damping off, which is actually caused by a fungus. And if you get that, you will notice your seedling gets out of the soil a little way, and then its stem typically will just kind of turn to mush in the middle, and the whole thing will fall over. That's called damping off, and that's caused by too high a humidity. So it's great to keep the humidity in while the seeds are germinating, but as soon as you see that seedling pop out of the soil, you want to get it into normal household conditions. Another thing, if you don't want to use the plastic film, that is very handy is you can use a cover like this, which are often called seedling domes or clone domes, and these fit perfectly over the trays as well to help keep in the humidity. And again, you don't need a tight seal. This is not something like if you're making clones, for example, where you want to maintain 80 to 100% humidity. When you first planting the seeds, 60, 70% humidity is plenty good enough. So in subsequent videos, we'll cover how to plant seeds, tips and tricks on how to get the best starts for your seeds, and then I'll go through how I transplant my seedlings in terms of thinning them out when I've planted 2 or 3 seeds in one pot, how to divide those, transplant them, transplanting from a 2-inch pot to a 4-inch pot to a 1-gallon pot. And then we're also going to do a video on tomato grafting. If you've never heard of grafted tomatoes, it's where you take a seedling of a tomato that you want to grow, an heirloom variety or a very tasty variety. You chop the top off of it, and then you start a separate seed that is a variety that has been bred not for good flavor, but specifically for its disease resistance and vigor that it imparts to the plant. And you chop the top off of the plant you want, you chop the top off of the one that's grown specifically for disease resistance and vigor. That's called the rootstock. You throw the rootstock top off and you clip the variety that you do want onto the rootstock. You let it heal for about 4 days and you will supercharge your tomato plants. I used to grow 20, 30 tomato plants every year to get enough tomatoes. But now that I've learned how to graft tomatoes, I really only have room for 4 to 8 tomato plants each year because they get huge. I typically start trimming them at 8 feet tall and about 4 feet wide when they're only about 3.5 months old from seed with a grafted plant. And I get at least 10 times more tomatoes from a grafted plant than I do from a non-grafted plant. So we'll do a video on how to graft tomatoes, and then we'll follow that throughout the summer so you can see how everything grows. Well, thank you very much. Happy gardening, and don't forget to like and subscribe on our YouTube channel.